Today we are going to be talking more about geometry and polygons, and we're going to be focusing on quadrilaterals. Today we're going to be classifying and comparing different kinds of quadrilaterals. Hopefully remember that quadrilaterals starts with quad, which means that it is a four-sided polygon. Up first, we're going to take a look we're going to skip the part about the seating chart. We're just going to focus on your basic quadrilateral. So a general quadrilateral has four sides, and as we talked about the other day, because it has four sides, it has four angles and four vertices. A general quadrilateral, there's nothing special about any of this to classify it. Any four-sided shape is going to be considered a quadrilateral. Up next, we're going to talk about trapezoids. Now, trapezoids, it's really interesting with the wording that they use because it's really going to impact like what is a trapezoid. Here, it says a trapezoid is a quadrilateral with at least one pair of, and this blank is going to be filled in with parallel sides. So parallel, remember, is when we have two lines that if drawn forever would never, ever, ever intersect. So remember, lines really go on in either direction forever. And parallel lines are two lines that if they traveled on forever, they would never intersect with one another. So if we take a look at this shape, we have this bottom line and this top side, and both of those are parallel. If they continued on forever, they would never intersect. Trapezoid has at least one pair of parallel sides. And that's important because it can also have two pair of parallel sides. It doesn't just have to be limited to that one pair anymore. Up next, after trapezoid, we are going to talk about a parallelogram. So a parallelogram is a special trapezoid. So what that means is that all parallelograms are in fact trapezoids. Now some trapezoids end up being parallelograms, but obviously not all of them. This shape that's on the left here, this one is not a parallelogram. It is a trapezoid, but it is not a parallelogram. On the right, though, this shape is in fact both a parallelogram and a trapezoid. So a parallelogram has opposite sides that are congruent and parallel. So if we take a look at this, we can see that we have a little tick mark here and here to let us know that the top and bottom are not only parallel, but they're congruent. And then over here on this side, we have the two little tick marks to let us know that these two sides are also congruent. So basically what we have here is a rectangle that somebody's kind of stepped on and pushed out askew. But the key note here is that a parallelogram is a special trapezoid. It has opposite sides that are congruent. So we don't just have one pair of parallel sides. We end up with two pair of parallel sides. Moving forward, now we have a rectangle. A rectangle is a parallelogram. It is a parallelogram because you can see here that we have two sets of opposite sides that are congruent and parallel, making it a parallelogram. The difference is what makes a rectangle special is that it has four right angles. So when we look in all of our corners are those perfect corners. So a rectangle has has opposite sides that are congruent, making it a parallelogram, and it has right angles and two pair of congruent and parallel sides. So again, rectangle is also a parallelogram. And if a rectangle is a parallelogram, that means that it is also a trapezoid and it is also a quadrilateral. A little bit more specific, or another one that's got some more specific aspects to it is a rhombus. So a rhombus is a special parallelogram. So again, it is a parallelogram, which also makes it a trapezoid, which also makes it a quadrilateral. Here, a rhombus has four congruent sides. right? So the difference between a rhombus and say a rectangle is that if we take a look at our corners, our angles are not 90-degree angles. So a rhombus does not have 90-degree angles. It can, but it doesn't have to. But it does have to have 4 congruent sides, and we see that because we have a little tick mark on each of these. Now, because all 4 sides are congruent, they also end up being that the opposite sides are in fact parallel, which is why it ends up being a parallelogram. Okay, up next, after a rhombus, we have our square. And a square is the most specific of all of our quadrilaterals that we can classify. In a square, we're going to have, well, first of all, it's a special parallelogram. And remember, if it's a parallelogram, then that also means that it is a trapezoid and it is a quadrilateral. Now, a square, though, has 4 congruent sides. So if it has 4 congruent sides, then a square is also a rhombus. And it has 4 right angles. And because a square has 4 right angles, that means that it is also a rectangle. All right, now to sort all of this out, we can draw a diagram. In this diagram, we're going to draw a big blob here, and everything inside of this blob will be a quadrilateral. Right? So everything inside of it is going to be a quadrilateral. Now, inside of our quadrilateral, we can also draw another really big blob, and everything inside of this blob will be a trapezoid. Remember, at least one pair of parallel sides. Now, inside of the trapezoids, we have another really big blob that's going to catch a lot of other quadrilaterals. And inside of here is going to be parallelogram. Now, inside of the parallelogram, we need to kind of disjoint this into 2 different circles. One of these circles is going to be our rectangle. The other circle, and this one's going to overlap, is going to be our rhombus. Now, remember the big difference between a rectangle and a rhombus is if we have 90-degree corners or not. So if all of the angles are 90 degrees, it's a rectangle, right? So we can draw one of those right in there. Now, if we have all 4 congruent sides, which can be tricky to draw, right? But hopefully we see it there. But we don't have 90-degree corners, we have a rhombus. Now, in the middle is where we end up with our 4 sides that are congruent. And I know that's not perfect. And we have 4 90-degree corners, angles. And this is where we end up with our square. So you can see from this picture, hopefully, that a square is a quadrilateral. It's inside of there. A square is a trapezoid. It's inside of that circle. A square is a parallelogram. It's inside of that one. A square is a rectangle and a square is a rhombus, right? Additionally, moving out, a rectangle is a parallelogram, which is inside of a trapezoid, which is inside of that big classification of quadrilaterals. And sometimes a rectangle can be a rhombus when we fall over here into this part where they overlap. Same thing with a rhombus. Sometimes it can be a rectangle, but it's always a parallelogram. It's always a trapezoid. It's always a quadrilateral. Hopefully that helps to make sense of this whole idea. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to go through these little shapes down here in the bottom corner. We're going to classify them. So first, let's start with this one. Where do you think it goes? Hopefully you see that we have one set of parallel sides, and so we have a trapezoid right there. This one right here looks to me like all of our sides are congruent, but we don't have 90 degrees, so there is our rhombus. This one, we have 2 opposite sets of congruent and parallel sides and 90-degree angles, so we have a rectangle. Let's see this one right here. This one looks like it is a square. Again, 4 congruent sides, 4 right angles going right there in the middle. Let's see, what do you think about that one? This one, 2 opposite sets of congruent and parallel sides. but no right angles. So here we are at a parallelogram. And let's just do one more for fun. Let's see, we'll pull out this one. Does this one fit into any of our categories? And the answer is no. So it's just out here floating by itself. It is a quadrilateral. And we'll go ahead and pull out the rest as well. Hopefully, as we pull them out, you are able to identify where they go. Now, this one is a little bit tricky because they kind of rotated it on us, but it is still just a square. See this one, rectangle. Oh, I lost that one. Don't know where it went. Here we are, another trapezoid and another parallelogram. Now, to clarify, right, this square could fit in this rectangle circle. It could fit in this rhombus circle. It fits in this parallelogram circle. It sits in this trapezoid circle. It is a quadrilateral, right? But we are going to make sure that we recognize how specific it is. Okay, here we are. We're going to fill in these blanks with always, sometimes, and never. A rhombus is blank a square. A rhombus is sometimes a square. A parallelogram is blank a rectangle. And a parallelogram is sometimes a rectangle. A rhombus is blank a parallelogram. In this one, a rhombus is always a parallelogram. A trapezoid is blank a parallelogram. Well, sometimes a trapezoid is a parallelogram. And then a square is always a rhombus. None of these ended up working out to be never. Okay, here we have quadrilateral ABCD, and just like we talked about yesterday with square or triangles, we can label quadrilaterals based on their angles. So this is angle A and angle B and angle C and angle D, and altogether this is quadrilateral A, B, C, and D. So if we take a look at this, if we were to break out a ruler, we would see that this side and this side are congruent, and we would also see that this side and this side are also congruent. Because the opposite sides are congruent, that means that side AB is going to be parallel to side DC, and side AD is parallel to side BC. So measure the sides. Are any of the sides congruent? And the answer is yes. Do we have any right angles in this quadrilateral? The answer here is no. So if we were to classify this, then we would say that the quadrilateral ABCD is in fact a parallel. Oh, Graham, I just feel like this word has got like 15 L's and a lot of vowels in it, and I do my best with spelling it. Hopefully you can too. All right, we're going to take a look at just a couple more, and then we're going to be done with this lesson for today. All right, what is this quadrilateral? We want to make sure that we label it in as many ways as possible. Well, hopefully, right off the bat, we notice we have 4 congruent sides, 4 right angles, and so it is a square. Now, if it is a square, that also means that it has to be a rectangle and it has to be a rhombus. Remember, that is where those two overlap. And then that sat inside of our parallelogram, which sat inside of our trapezoid, which sat inside of our quadrilateral. It's all of those things. Let's take a look at this one. All right, so here we have 4 congruent sides. So it has to be a rhombus. We don't have any right angles, so it can't be a square. It also can't be a rectangle because of that, but it can be a parallelogram, a trapezoid, and a quadrilateral. Last one. Here we have a couple of right angles, but we don't have 4. We have a couple of congruent sides, but they're not opposite of one another. We do have a 90-degree angle here and a 90-degree angle here, right? Which means that these two sides, top and bottom, are in fact parallel. And if we have one set of parallel sides, then, oh, not a parallelogram, sorry, then that means we have a trapezoid. And if it's got 4 sides, so it is a quadrilateral. All right. Oh, not that one, sorry. Here we are. So last thing I want you to do is take a look at these two images. And these are really fun looking buildings, and they have a lot of different quadrilaterals in them. I'd like for you to look around and see what you can find. Do you see any squares? Do you see any rectangles? I mean, rectangles are pretty easy. But in these two shapes, it might be a little bit tricky. So do you see squares, rectangles, rhombus, um, trapezoids? Like, what do you see? I would like to just start off by pointing out that it looks to me like right over here on the window in this image, right there, we have a parallelogram, right? We have two sets of congruent sides that are opposite of one another and parallel. So take a look around, see what you can find. I don't know that I found any squares, so if you find a square, send me a message and let me know. And hopefully this lesson helped you out today.